Former ZTE General Counsel Ashley Oblong had only been with the Chinese telecom giant for a few months when he discovered the company's elaborate plot to sell millions of dollars worth of devices to Iran and other sanctioned countries. He documented the experience in his new book, Standing Up to China, the criminal fine imposed on ZTE, which ended up to be more than $286 million, is the highest ever imposed for an IEEPA violation. Ashley Oblong knows firsthand the inside story of the ZTE legal saga and the consequences of trying to do the right thing, and he's going to tell us all about it. Ashley, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ashley, before we start, can you briefly introduce to our audience your legal career at ZTE and also before that, Huawei? How was that experience like in general?
Sure. I started at Huawei in 2010 and worked my way up to assistant general counsel for the device team and learned quite a bit. Obviously, I had worked in-house at large companies, international companies, but had never worked for a Chinese telecom such as Huawei. So there was quite a bit to learn about the culture, the difference in culture between Western culture and Eastern. So it took some time to learn that. And then started at ZTE in October of 2011. So took a lot of those same things that I had learned about Eastern culture, about Chinese culture, and took those to ZTE as well.
So, what would you say is the biggest difference between a Chinese company, in this case Huawei or ZTE, and a Western country that you have experience working with?
I think a lot of it has to do with relationships. Here in the United States or Western culture, we're very matter of fact when it comes to business decisions. It's A plus B equals C. It's a very straight line. And in Eastern culture, it's you don't start immediately with negotiation. You get to know the person, you get to know the company, and it's only at the very last moment that you ever discuss negotiation. So that took some getting used to, but I would say that's probably the largest difference between Western and Eastern culture as it relates to business.
Right. And did you notice any red flags back then in retrospect?
Yeah, obviously looking back now, there are plenty of red flags, and that's well documented in my book. At the time, I didn't see those, or I should say, I didn't want to see them. As I talk about and discuss in my book, I had landed my dream job at 39, 40 years old, becoming the young general counsel for one of the largest telecom companies in the world. And many of those red flags I didn't see, and we can certainly talk about those. But looking back now, and after discussing that with the FBI and giving him all the information, those red flags were quite apparent.
Mhm. So your career sort of took a abrupt turn in 2012. This is a year when Reuters reported evidence that ZTE had been illegally selling U.S. parts to Iran. So tell us, what was it like inside the company back then when that story broke? Were people panicking? What was the mood inside the company back then?
Yeah, that I detail that in the book quite a bit. The company was really crazy. Everyone was in a panic, as you suggest. As I talk about, the article came out, Reuters article, and what Reuters had was a copy of the contract between ZTE China and the country of Iran. And what it detailed was that ZTE was selling hundreds of millions of dollars of spying technology. And not only did Reuters have that contract, but they also had the packing list. So we're all familiar with a packing list, telling us if you go to like IKEA and you buy something, it tells you everything in the box. Now imagine a over 900-page packing list telling you all the spying technology and surveillance equipment that ZTE China was selling to Iran. And what made it so bad was it not only told you the equipment, but it also told you the US component parts that was in that equipment. And that was the real damning part for ZTE because that was breaking the law here in the US regarding re-exporting. And what that means is you cannot sell equipment to the embargoed countries. And what I detail in the book is that ZTE had created an elaborate scheme of shell companies and entities where they would buy the US component parts, and those component parts would, through these shell companies, work their way back to ZTE for them to put into the equipment and then to sell to the embargoed countries such as Iran.
Were there any discussions or even conjectures inside the company on how the document got leaked into the media?
Well, that was what really was at the issue within ZTE was how did they get it? How did they get it? And at the time, one of the Chinese attorneys from ZTE who worked for me said to me, "How did they get this? How did they get this?" And I explained, "It doesn't matter how they got that. What we need to be focusing on is what we do next." And I asked her, and this was a big red flag for me, and it's detailed in the book. I said, "Why are you so concerned about how they got it?" And she looked me in the eye and she said, "Because now we can't hide anything." And that was quite a red flag at the moment.
Right. And you also mentioned in the book that you actually received a call from someone called Preston a few months before the Reuters report. So what was that call all about? Is there like a coincidence in timing?
The article came out in March of 2012, and in a few months before that, in December of 2011, Preston, and that was his U.S. given name, which has been changed for the book. But he was an attorney at ZTE back in Shenzhen, at the headquarters of ZTE. And he called me and he said, "Ashley, is there a way for us legally to sell to the embargoed countries of Iran?" And as an example. And I stopped for a minute and I thought, is he really asking me that? How can we legally can sell to the embargoed countries? But I found an attorney. I'm not an expert in export import laws, but I found an expert in it. And he mentioned the same thing. And she said, "I don't think there is, but if you can give me more details and facts of what you're trying to do, I can give you a better answer." And that attorney then called me back and said, "Did I hear that correctly? Are they really wanting to, quote, legally sell to the embargoed countries?" And I said, "That's what I understand." So when we followed up with Preston the very next day, he said, "Don't worry about it. Forget I ever said that. Let's just act like that never happened." So again, looking back, that was a red flag in itself.
Right. And you were asked to prepare for the Department of Commerce requested documents. You actually visited ZTE's Shenzhen office. What did you find out that ultimately led to your decision to quit your job and expose your findings to the FBI?
So as I mentioned, right after that Reuters article came out, I was served with a subpoena from the Department of Commerce asking for both the copy of that contract as well as a copy of that packing list. So we had two things going on at that time. We had hired a large law firm to represent us because the House Intelligence Committee was doing an investigation into ZTE as well as Huawei, my former employer, that they were a threat to US security. Now we have this subpoena where the Department of Commerce is asking for the contract as well as the packing list from the sale to Iran. And so I went to China because the House Intelligence wanted to meet with ZTE and also to take a look at this contract. And what I discovered really changed my life. What happened was I was led to a dark room. There was no windows. I wasn't allowed to actually see the contract or hold a physical copy. They projected it onto a wall, and I had 15 minutes to look at both the contract and the packing list. And what I saw in the contract basically was there was a section in the contract with Iran that says how we will get around US export laws. And I couldn't believe how brazen and over the top that statement was, but it broke down the shell companies and the entities that ZTE had created in order to get around these US export laws by buying equipment from the US manufacturers and through schemes and shell companies, get those back to ZTE. So it was very brazen and it detailed how they were going to get around those laws. And at the time, as I detail in the book, when I pointed that out, ZTE wanted to destroy any evidence that related to the selling of that equipment. They wanted to do anything they could to not comply with the investigation, both with the Department of Commerce and House Intelligence. And then they wanted me to lie. And that's when the real issue came about. And when I knew that as an ethical duty as an attorney, I had a duty to report their actions.
So that was when you finally made the decision to report to the FBI, but you didn't immediately leave the company, right? So what was that interim episode like for you?
Well, exactly. So I came back to the United States and knew that I had a duty as an attorney. As an attorney, obviously you have a duty of what they say, attorney-client privilege. So if your client tells you they've done something in the past, you have a duty to keep that confidential. But you also have a duty if your client is telling you they're going to further a crime in the future. And that's what ZTE was telling me. We are going to further a crime. We're going to lie to the government. We're going to destroy any evidence that shows that we ever did anything wrong. And we're going to make you the person who says that we've done nothing wrong. So I was in an ethical dilemma, and I came back to the United States. I'm an attorney. All my good friends are attorneys. My former wife is an attorney. But I ended up hiring 5 different attorneys to represent me. And my criminal lawyer had me meet with the FBI, where I detailed all the shell entities, the scheme that they had created, and they put together an affidavit. And what happened was, a few months after I gave all that information to the FBI, ironically, that information was to be confidential. And unfortunately, it was leaked. And once it got leaked, that's when everything went haywire in my life. And that's really documented in the book.
Right. So our audience can take a further look at the book to get all the details. But I wanted to sort of circle back a little bit. So we know ZTE's sanctions violations finally resulted in the largest fine in U.S. history, which is quite remarkable in and of itself. What lessons should either Chinese firms and their legal counsels take away from that episode, from your experience? What's your suggestions to them?
Sure. So like you mentioned, the ZTE finally admitted to it in 2017 and paid the largest penalty at the time, along with sanctions. They paid $1.2 billion in sanctions, and had all kinds of restrictions put on them. Ironically, 1 year later, they broke those rules and had to pay another $1.2 billion, so over almost $2.5 billion in penalties. And I think the lesson learned, I always thought when ZTE finally admitted to wrongdoing, that it would be not only a lesson for them, but also to other companies such as Huawei, and we even saw recently in the news Ericsson. But that these compliance rules, these restrictions are serious, and that the U.S. and the government takes these serious and is trying to protect citizens and to protect from wrongdoing, as we saw with Ericsson recently. They were paying money to terror groups, and so I think the lessons learned is compliance laws, which are now in full force, are serious.
Lots of our audience are from the investment community. When it comes to Chinese firms like ZTE and Huawei, what kind of compliance red flags should investors watch out for? What should they read and learn, and who should they talk to learn more about how a company actually works and potential risks further down the road?
That's a great question. When I started at both Huawei and at ZTE, the compliance laws and compliance groups were just getting started, really. And large companies didn't have compliance departments or attorneys that are certified in compliance. And each company, I say compliance, and what does that mean? Well, that means that each industry has different rules and regulations that they need to follow. In this example here with obviously Huawei and ZTE, you have the rules that they need to follow, the FCC and things like that. So a good compliance department or attorneys or other individuals who are certified to make sure that a company is staying compliant with those rules and regulations. And I think the lesson learned was compliance was growing at the same time that this event was happening. I know that companies now have really robust compliance departments, and I guess my suggestion to any company would be make sure that you have a compliance department that is well versed in the rules and regulations for your industry to make sure you are in compliance and can document that as needed to any government regulation or compliance group.